Why would a war-ravaged nation, reeling from the costliest global conflict in history, suddenly give away billions of dollars, $13 billion to be exact, to rebuild the very continent where much of that war took place? Was it generosity, guilt, a strategic bribe, or something far more calculated? The Marshall Plan is often hailed as one of the most successful foreign aid programs in history. But behind the celebration lies a web of geopolitical chess moves, economic self-interest, and a desperate gamble against the creeping shadow of communism. And here's the kicker. What if this act of unprecedented aid wasn't just about rebuilding Europe, but about saving America? Let's rewind to the world of 1947. The ashes of World War II are still smoldering across Europe. Cities like Berlin, Warsaw, and Rotterdam lie in ruins. The human toll is almost incomprehensible. Over 60 million dead, economies obliterated, food scarce, and currencies nearly worthless. Yet amid this devastation, the United States is thriving. Its factories are booming, its infrastructure untouched by the war, its economy supercharged by years of wartime production. America holds over half the world's industrial capacity and 75% of global gold reserves. But this balance of power comes with a problem. Europe, once the United States' biggest trading partner, can no longer afford to buy American goods. Its economies are paralyzed. If Europe can't recover, global trade collapses, and with it, the post-war U.S. economy. Enter Secretary of State George C. Marshall, a World War II hero and towering figure of American diplomacy. In a speech at Harvard in June 1947, he proposes a radical idea. The United States will offer massive aid to Europe, not as charity, but to restore economic health and political stability. What became known as the Marshall Plan was born. But Marshall's speech didn't come out of nowhere. Behind the scenes, the Truman administration was in crisis mode. The Soviet Union was expanding its influence, supporting communist parties in Greece, Turkey, France, and Italy. There was a real fear that a crumbling, impoverished Europe would fall into Moscow's orbit. The solution had to be bold. The plan would send money, food, fuel, machinery, and expertise to rebuild European economies from the ground up. But this wasn't a blank check. Countries had to cooperate, open their financial books, and commit to free market reforms. 16 nations joined the program, from the UK and France to smaller players like Luxembourg and Norway. Even the Soviet Union and its satellite states were invited, though Stalin quickly rejected the offer, fearing it would erode his control. And so, the money began to flow. Between 1948 and 1952, the United States transferred $13 billion, over $150 billion in today's dollars. But the aid wasn't just cash. It included American wheat to feed hungry cities, tractors to revitalize agriculture, steel to rebuild factories, and technical know-how to modernize infrastructure. The effects were dramatic. European economies surged. Industrial production in Western Europe grew by more than 35% in just 4 years. Countries like West Germany experienced an economic miracle. France's output rebounded. Unemployment fell. Political stability returned. But this wasn't a simple tale of money in, prosperity out. There were tensions. Some Americans balked at sending taxpayer dollars overseas while domestic needs remained unmet. Critics accused the program of favoring U.S. corporations, who profited handsomely from supplying materials. In Europe, there were debates over sovereignty and dependence. The requirement for economic cooperation led to the creation of institutions that paved the way for the European Union. But it also meant giving up a measure of national control. And then there was the Soviet backlash. The Marshall Plan drew a red line through Europe. Western nations received aid and moved toward capitalism. Eastern Bloc countries under Soviet pressure were cut off. The Cold War solidified. The Marshall Plan didn't just rebuild Europe, it divided it. But for all its complications, the results were clear. By 1952, Western Europe was largely self-sustaining, politically stable, and economically vibrant. America had spent a fortune, but in return, it had gained loyal allies, strong trading partners, and a bulwark against communism. Yet this leads to a deeper question. Why did it work? Most foreign aid programs before and after the Marshall Plan failed. They were poorly managed, corrupted, or misaligned with local needs. But the Marshall Plan was different in several ways. First, it was time-bound and targeted. It wasn't meant to last forever. It was a short, intensive burst. Second, it required recipient countries to take ownership of their recovery. This wasn't passive aid. It was a partnership. Third, it was rooted in mutual benefit. As Europe recovered, America's exports rose, new markets opened, and geopolitical alliances strengthened. But the story doesn't end in the 1950s. In the decades since, the Marshall Plan has been invoked repeatedly. After the Cold War, after natural disasters, after the 2008 financial crisis. Even today, policymakers debate a green Marshall Plan for climate change or a digital Marshall Plan for the global South. But do the same conditions exist? Here's where the data gets sobering. Since 1960, the US has spent over $1.5 trillion on foreign aid. And yet, few programs have replicated the success of the Marshall Plan. Many nations receiving aid today remain economically stagnant or politically unstable. According to the World Bank, nearly 60% of the countries that have received decades of foreign aid are still considered low or middle income. Corruption, poor governance, and lack of infrastructure often prevent real progress. So what made the post-war moment so unique? Part of it was timing. A devastated but educated continent, desperate for rebuilding, with institutions already in place to manage aid effectively. Part of it was alignment. The goals of donor and recipient matched. Europe wanted to rebuild, and America needed it to recover. Part of it was fear. The Soviet threat created urgency and political will rarely seen in peacetime. And that raises a critical modern parallel. Today, America faces another global competition. Not with communism, but with authoritarian capitalism, especially from China. The Belt and Road Initiative is essentially a Marshall Plan in reverse. Billions in infrastructure loans to developing nations, buying influence and building alliances. In Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, Chinese-funded highways, ports, and power plants are expanding rapidly. But instead of grants, these are often loans, with strings attached. So while the West debates and delays, a new economic order is being written. And this time, the script isn't coming from Washington. Which brings us to the final question. What can we learn? First, aid only works when it's coupled with local initiative, reform, and institutional strength. Money alone doesn't solve structural problems. Second, timing and urgency matter. The Marshall Plan succeeded because the world was at an inflection point. The window for high-impact aid was narrow and used wisely. Third, strategy must guide generosity. The Marshall Plan wasn't just goodwill. It was a geopolitical investment with long-term returns. And now, a warning. As global crises multiply, climate, migration, digital inequality, the temptation will grow to throw money at the problem. But unless aid is grounded in shared interest, accountability, and long-term vision, we risk pouring billions into the sand. The Marshall Plan reminds us that generosity is powerful, but strategy makes it enduring. So what's the next Marshall Plan? Will we recognize the moment before it passes? Or will history judge us for missing the opportunity to rebuild? Again? If you found this breakdown valuable, take a moment to subscribe for more deep dives into the economic decisions that shaped our world and continue to shape our future. Leave a comment. What modern crisis do you think deserves a Marshall Plan response? And who should lead it?